said earlier today, how do you think about a place that doesn't look different than any other place or looks, in fact, even not distinguishable at all? How to perceive a place that's otherwise ordinary and where the heritage is not historic looking. So for us, it became this act of deep listening. The community had, some members of the community had become part of another experiment led by Suzanne Lacey and Rick Lowe, which brought 350 people together for one evening to talk about the rapid redevelopment in the region around Charleston. And one of those community members came to me and said, we would like some artists to come. We have issues and these problems of our road being expanded, this threat to our community, and we need a community center. So I put together a team that I was working with, a number of other sites at that time, kind of thinking, a listening group. Ernesto Pujol, a performance artist, Walter Hood, a landscape architect and designer, and Kendra Hamilton, a poet. And we entered into a kind of open-ended dialogue. We were suspicious about a community center. We'd surveyed communities in the area and saw those community centers, cinder block places that were closed up, sad looking, and whether that was to happen or not, it didn't seem the starting point. So to get to the no outcome where the outcome had already been predicted, to sort of come to what was the aims of the community center impulse anyway, so that yes, maybe some goals would be found, but how could we live with those aims for a while and sort of understand what were the values under those aims. I share with you this, another plan, and I appreciate Kerstin's of mapping her process and diagramming it. This was not one which we used during the 4 years, also 4 years of engagement with the Phillips community, but it is something that I use to kind of go back over that history to talk to you about. This is a practice circle designed by an artist and other practitioners collective called Art Way of Thinking, which comes out of Venice. And I had worked with them in the past, in the mid-90s, in a project in Atlanta that kind of concretized their practice as social practitioners. And then we were out of touch for 10 or more years. And when we came back together, we found that we sort of arrived at the same point. So as one sort of moves around this possibility, this kind of roadmap to keep track of where we're going or to remind us some steps we need to do, or when we go backwards in a process and we need to start again where we might be at this point, I'll move through as we talk about Phillips. So yes, as Leah said, we begin with observation. Absolutely, observation. And what is the situation at the moment? What is, if you will, the political imaginary, the social imaginary that is this so-called reality? And then what kind of data, real data, can we organize and find that describes that situation? And things like interviews are part of that, so that out of that information we get some inspiration. And for this creative team, the first point of inspiration absolutely was a map that the elders, you saw lots of women here, bring up the gender question from earlier, you saw lots of women, but when we had meetings it was the elders, and the elders are men. And a map that the elders pulled out, which was from about 1876, which showed that division of land, all of this being the Phillips plantation, and then as you see in this very English lot line, sharing the resources of road and creek, these various sections that became the plots that were bought by individual families. And so this, yes, this was an inspiration, and then how do we kind of widen that frame to think about where that is in this location? If everyone just can kind of note, this is where Charleston is above my finger, not tall enough there to do that. And then how can we begin to see what this is? You know, what tools do we have today that allow us to go back and through those same lot lines, through satellites, indicate find those indications where they exist elsewhere. So not only in Phillips, but just with one session, finding in these other areas that same lot configuration, which says, yes, these were also freemen communities. These settlements that existed then tell us not only what that change was at that time in the 1870s, but that the first residents there were themselves enslaved, because they were the workers of the rice plantations that were Charleston, that made this both built and natural environment, but that today make them look like anything else because they are surrounded by suburban, we consider suburban higher class, not lower class, suburban development that has to do with wide roads, highways, strip malls, gas stations, fast food chains, and that make all of these other things invisible. So it was necessary to go and get the information to begin to look at this, and let's see if my cursor will do this. So we still see, this is still that same, here's that road, which is kind of like the arrow that goes through the heart, which is that shape of Phillips, and yet we see some other things of where some land was sold, right? And so now, where one or less or a couple houses exist on that 10-acre plot, you have this amount, each one of these little black dots being a house, a kind of McMansion along the hardscape of a road. But we didn't have maps of Phillips, and if you were to, at that time gone and bought your traditional road map of the Charleston area, Rand McNally being the typical American map, that you would have purchased, you would have had Phillips under the legend in the corner in the upper right. So there were no maps that had conflated that past and present, that historic map, and then what was happening with these settlements. And sorry, in our bit of washed out area here, but if you can follow me, that each one of these sinuous sort of purpley lines, which you see here, have tons of houses on them throughout here. So how could we kind of hone in first in making that map, which I just showed you, and then taking another version and detail of that map, and with the citizens going and indicating some things that that for them were mapping of their history. What was the first church? What was another kind of area? The lady who said, Betty, who said that, lots of good people came from Phillips. There is a U.S. general, a general from the 1970s. So his house is on there, just to say that Betty herself, having grown up in Phillips, lives in gated communities, which are all of those things there. So I just want to continue to not have us fall into perhaps black and white assumptions here. But anyway, here's that little, spiraling spot that I showed you of when a line gets cut through Phillips, and then now we have a giant development. And then, golf courses, right? The golf course. These are the people who want to now go back, and now they are getting their new home, their second home, their fourth home, their country home, and it just as you described, Leah, it is the golf course culture and others. But what that golf course culture does in the upper portion of this photograph is, of course, when you got to keep that green grass being perfect because it's got to match the image that brought you there to begin with, then you have the runoff of all of the insecticides and other things because you're in this damn hot Charleston tropical culture, an environment, and then you've killed all the crabs in the creek, and people used to eat those crabs, or the gentleman who makes baskets for a living now has to go elsewhere and buy grass, but also travel an hour to get that grass because it can't grow there any longer. Or another view along that creek, because if you're the person who's on the house which is the closest to the creek, then you get your own dock. But part of this being able to see what isn't there or is ordinary, became, I think you mentioned that you had, worked with overhead photography and drones. This was a helicopter visit of the creative team. And, then what it strikingly makes evident is that on the left is the new gated community. And that's something, right? Houses and boats and docks and so forth. But on the left is nothing, except that nothing is Phillips, right? So like, what's the matter with these people? They didn't develop, they didn't do something, it's all overgrown. Okay, so that was part of our observations. From there, from that inspiration, how do we begin to make something together? And part of that making together was maps, not just my students and others from Chicago that were brought together with that team, but yes, college students who live in the Phillips community coming together to talk about their sense. The middle school students, people drawing these maps, and then in this time period of kind of coming up with relational activities that could expand that knowledge and change that knowledge, we got to a point in those 4 years where it was like, wait a minute, we've covered this with you folks before, and now we're just sort of saying the same thing to each other, and it doesn't feel like we're getting anywhere. But we had been excited as outsiders, and that outsider and insider conversation had catalyzed some things for a while, and then we were running amok. So how can you honor and prize the fact that you're an outsider and what that can do? And okay, well, now we all need to be outsiders because this outsider-insider conversation was starting to stall. How can we all be outsiders? And the team puts together a weekend bus tour for community members. And we go to these 4 places south of Charleston, 2 in Georgia, 2 in Florida, places that had succumbed or had surpassed this claim on their land to be redeveloped. Sapelo Island, there are only 12 African Americans still living on Sapelo Island off of Georgia because the Reynolds Corporation and the Georgia University have taken over that land. But they make remarkable fishing nets in the old way, in the old African way. Harris Neck, Georgia. The woman who you see in the red, a song that she sang was heard by a musicologist who traced it back to a song of a particular village in Sierra Leone. She and her son are among the few who continue to live there because Harris Neck was taken over by the U.S. government during World War II to create an airstrip, and then they were told they'd get their land back after the war, but we're always at war, so you never get your land back. This is America Beach in Florida, started by an African-American insurance firm that wanted to create recreation without humiliation. And people there still hold on to that part, exceedingly valuable land on the Atlantic coast. Or further inland, Zora Neale Hurston, a folklorist and author's place of birth, and which has regenerated its economy and its possibility to still be there by holding a festival about her, but also by joining forces with the white community next door, because both of them were going to be wiped out to become another off-ramp from the main highway so you could get to Disney World faster. And of course, good fortune was, in that white community was a quite well-known and respected traffic consultant who not only worked on that, but who at the end of this road trip came back to the Phillips community with us to work, so that we could move from all of these ways in which we were kind of living this story together to some sort of action, and the road was a good place to start. And with this individual, Walter Kulash, and then Walter Hood, our landscape designer in particular, coming up with alternatives. And yes, the county got wind of what we were doing and immediately came in with a new plan that showed that they would do it differently than the 4-lane highway they wanted to create, that in the little short film was those young girls are trying to cross because families are situated on both sides of that road. And we said that's very nice, but we're coming up with some other alternatives, which instead of increasing the speed of the road, actually decreases the speed of the road. Again, those maps that were created became a way of doing this because there were no visualizations. What this leads to, as we come to the last stage of this, of integration, or if you will, imaginary, is how can we look at this place differently? And what might happen if there are resources. And so what the group did was to create what we call a Lifeways Plan, that if there were resources and change, how could that change happen that was consistent with the way that people live in the land and some of the desires that they have for what they would do. So not about adding artworks, not even temporary artworks, but really in the end changing, we hope, how people perceived of Phillips, and more so perhaps how Phillips perceived of itself. So some examples of what that integration can be, or what that changed consciousness can be when we arrive at outcomes that are not expected. One that comes from that listening, working very closely with the Phillips Association president, Richard Habersham, he's a truck driver, was discussing one day, how do people have their privacy living here? And he said, well, when I want privacy from my neighbors, I just let my bushes grow. I just let the overgrown take care of this. And this notion of the overgrown, that this unintended growth, or intended but untended growth, along these historic property lines could both describe the place as well as, in a very natural, soft, and non-threatening way, also cultivate the place. So what is this overgrown about? This overgrown is a huge ecological corridor. It helps water drainage that the hardscapes in the other communities doesn't. Provides places for kids to play. It is this privacy screen, but it's also a flyway for birds and others. And so this place that lacked all possibility of distinction, we thought, really became an example of cooperative land management. That in fact, the life way of Phillips was living in this really green way, and now this place that was nothing became this model of a sustainable community. So that led to this notion of a life way instead of a master plan. What is a way that describes how people live there and then can be used even as the artwork circle, as a kind of reference that we go back to at one time, honoring how people live, and then also in some way giving the chance to move into that future. And for the artist group, and I will say that as a curator, part of my role was every time there were wonderful ideas of we should do this or we should do that, was to say, yes, now let's sleep on that. Because once we go into that production, we're sort of done with the inquiry, or done with the inquiry for a while. So it took a lot of courage not for us to make art, not for the Phillips community to insist on building a building, but to take 4 years of time to really think about and arrive at some shared vision, understanding really what were the values at stake, and how Phillips not only had a heritage and a certain way of living now, but that it was a community that had a place in the future. Now, what happens out of these things and these unintended outcomes is not always something that a cultural and urban planner or an artist or a curator is at the helm of. And I think we forget that, and in part because we don't always have the chance to go back and listen, but the sustained way of working or continued way of working in Charleston gave me that possibility. So one of the other things that I will say came out of this notion was a relationship with an individual who helped us many times as we were thinking through this. His name is Michael Allen. He's an educator, National Park Service ranger in one of the surrounding federal sites, which is there in Charleston. And he's an African-American Charlestonian by birth. And it turned out that he was very inspired by the way that artists were looking differently and what they were thinking about, and this widening the frame and listening and dialogues that were happening iteratively here. He said that that inspired him towards something for which he was the inspiration for. And during the course of our working there, with Michael Allen's drafting and pushing, the United States Congress passed the Gullah Geechee Corridor Act. That designates the cultural heritage corridor of West Africans from North Carolina to Florida as a site of research, as a site of preservation, and as a site of continued and evolving living. We would have never had the gumption to think we'd pass an act of Congress. A couple of other outcomes. Walter Hood, who was our professional as a landscape designer working in an artist team, found this possibility of working in a non-goal-oriented way, practical, wanting to do something, but not defining the goal at the outset, to be so counter to the professional practices in which he is trained and in which he teaches at University of California, Berkeley, that he came back to school at the School of the Art Institute and got an MFA. Because he really wanted to make a point about how professional practices do not look at how people live in a place, but rather want people to live in the place that they design. One way in which he described for his master's thesis this idea was what he calls speculative practice, so that there's a practical line going through, and that's one of the other diagrams we saw, from the kind of point A to point B, but that along that practical line, there are also things which we bring in which are speculative practices. What are the simple things like the overgrown? How do we also acknowledge our doubt, for instance? But how do we bring in the other sources that are meaningful to us, whether it's literature, music, our traveling to other places, and so forth? All of these notions, encountering strangers. And then, yes, something happens. At some point, we have a determination where these things coalesce, but speculation, or as we've talked about here today, experimentation, is one of the things that gives that freedom, that we can begin to imagine something and actually enact it. Now, I will also say that that what we were doing there, and this kind of dynamic process, which Walter Hood was able to talk about, also had some other things that those artists at that time had not been involved in, but certainly played into where we had arrived with this Phillips Community Project. So I'm showing you some images from things which had happened a decade before in Charleston, and then it will move into things that were happening simultaneously, because after having done one show in 1991, which went from start to finish in 15 months, then it was 10 years later I went back, and when I went back at the invitation to do another show, I said, no, I will come back and I will listen with artists, and then we'll see. And then we went back for 10 years. So many, many different things happened. But I want to say, and to echo what Mick was saying, that these things, okay, they weren't exactly white cubes, they were highly contextual, but they were ephemeral, and they were works of art, and they were physical, and they were by, artists whose names, some of which continue to be known in careers that continue to advance. Nonetheless, as those works of art highly played into the thought processes, not only of the artists, but the experience of the community, the experience of people who had lived with this. Michael Allen, my National Park Service guy, he didn't work with us in this 10 years before. He's a young guy, but his uncle was someone who worked with the artist David Hammonds on this house, which continues to stand in Charleston, and the park, which is the companion piece of this element. And David Hammonds' House of the Future became prophetic in that way. Now, I want to just reflect for a moment before getting into sort of critical questions about what it is to be engaged in these processes as a curator. And I suppose it has to do very much with this notion of what is art and what is its materiality or its actuality, perhaps is a better word. And I can certainly say that moving out of museums and at a time when I had evolved a practice which was very much about working with artists on works that had not existed before an exhibition came to pass and many times didn't exist afterwards, doing that within a museum frame, that increasingly I was finding that I was curating process, not the work, not the preservation of the object, but what was the process. And part of that curating of process was to simply hold the space open, hold the space in a way that it was actual. Nothing's happening, we can't point to it, right? But that it continued to reaffirm we're doing something. We're holding a space, and sometimes that space was filled, as you see now, with people who came into stakeholder meetings in very amazing sort of settings that told their own story too. Of course, care and caring are at the etymological root of curating, and to have these deep conversations is very intense, but also about caring to listen to somebody else, and caring to continue to hold that space open. That's Michael. And then to do that over and over, but with some sense of evolution, some sense of looking for what are those paths, so how you sort of curate through that, and then finding among others a same sense of caring too, that they are the curators of their community, and being in this shared inquiry, which, yes, as was just said by Leah, is a process of growth, so that this knowledge is flowing in all directions and can be used for more than one thing. But it is also very much about, in holding this space, being content enough, being comfortable enough with one's discomfort to also sit with not knowing. And not knowing is where we move to the next stage. Now, with these projects that you're seeing, I'll just kind of condense in my conclusion that there's sort of 3 points that I want to say vis-a-vis debates that go on and prevail within our field of art and art criticism. And that is in regard to time that artists spend in a place and whether they should be there or not, experience, and audience. So time. In 1997, the American critic Lucy Lepard published a book called Lure of the Local, about artists going and, in some way colonizing other people was one of the themes. So the good and the bad as she saw it. But within that, she criticized artists for taking up invitations for short expeditions to lesser known places or people whose heritage was different than their own. And at the end of the day, it didn't matter if they were there for 4 days or 4 years. Right. But anyway, taking up these invitations and the term parachuting, I'm very happy to have not heard that in here today, okay? But so here comes the sin. Parachuting was what was pronounced as the exploitation of community histories for the artist's own career ends. Among her prime examples was Places with the Past, a number of images you saw in my show from 1991. Now, Lucy never saw that show. She never talked to any citizens who were there. She never had that experience of something that was up for 3 months. But anyway, it was only 3 months and the artist had only been there at the most a year before, so it fit the bill. It fit the bill, as she said. The Places with the Past is the model for art about place, rooted less in local community than in myth, filtered through the avant-garde that tends to be strong in form and weak in connectedness. Now, it's true that I didn't know I was going to do more there. And in fact, that show ended rather peculiarly with the people who had invited me all being fired midway through the show, because the founder of the Spoleto Festival, the organizing institution, Giancarlo Menotti, not only hated contemporary art, as he hated jazz and other things which had filtered into his opera festival, but he was also trying to gain back the power of the institution, feeling that that institution was the patrimony of his adopted son, former lover. Everything's an opera. Okay, but anyway, those people were lost their jobs before the show even happened, so none of us expected to go back. But that's not my point about time. My point about time is that we made work sincerely of commitment and love. And where that went to, we couldn't predict. We didn't have a master plan of art and cultural relationship. And people there had, for the first time, a free event of the Spoleto Festival. And when they went in there, many of whom were provoked by Menotti's outrage on opening day, it was that they didn't find contemporary art that was a slap in the face, a shock. They found their history. So, if we never went back, something happened. Okay, that's Lucy. But I say to that, we need to consider individual transformative experiences that people have, the possibility of what art does. How much do art critics not like art that they would be so circumspect? Okay, so that brings me to my second point, experience. Whose experience matters? Critics have a big problem in valuing the experience of people who are outside the art world. Again, the class, the education, all of this, if it's not parallel to them, then it's not a valid experience. And they don't own up to their own experience. Claire Bishop speaks of the need to be on guard against that and not to get too close to personal experience. This doesn't add up in art. And when she and Mi Wan Kwan cite an experience, it is always through the lens of an art star who they were there with, and then they were able to kind of download. And yeah. When there are other experiences that we bring forward and people have their deep emotional connection to something, well, critics know how to deal with that, too. And that's a feel-good syndrome about participants, so that things like meetings and dinners and installations that lead to a sense of satisfaction, that is the evidence, the actual manifestation of that transformative experience, breathing out that experience into some way which is about that vitality, because there is a growth felt and a depth and a sense of unity among these participants in a community, is, of course, plagued by the same old European philosophical mind-body split in experience. So it's a class issue, and those people felt good, but we can't really take that too far in the literature. So experiencing process. What does it mean to experience process? What is it to really embody it? And how can we, in social practice that also demands a different kind of literature, in some way not see this as surrendering or soft or emotional, but rather what that vulnerability to experience can mean to really come close to the work. So I conclude with audiences. How can we know what those kind of audiences experience? Because feel good is true, but dismissed. If process is embodied in those processes, and maybe we can even say they're life-changing, then what does it mean for other audiences? Can there be an experience for what critics call the secondary audience? So maybe they're feeling good and, we'll let you have it, but we don't think it's too important, but then nobody else can have an experience. And I say no. That's not true. Claire Bishop says in order to have an experience for this other audience, this so-called secondary audience. We need to have what she refers to as a third term. We need to have an object, an image, a story, a film, a spectacle, something that other people can be part of. I don't think that's true. I don't think that's the only way that human experience is shared or had. So here, I would just, before closing, like to introduce John Dewey, an American philosopher's concept of art, art as experience and experience as art, in which no third term is needed. It is a direct infusion. And he thought all forms of communication are open to being experienced, and, moreover, experienced aesthetically. Artworks are just the common one we have. And artworks, Dewey thought, were a particularly good one because it's a refined example of affording aesthetic experience. Of course, then it gets hijacked by museums and cultural planners and others who put their frame around it. But for Dewey, whether it's a painting or social practice, or whether it's documentation, or someone's narrative of it, we can have an aesthetic experience. Because he tells us that not only art is the experience, not the object. The art lies in our experience of the thing, not the thing itself. But also experience is art. Experience is something that gives rise to the level of the aesthetic when it profoundly touches us. So in art or social practice or an experience in the lives of people in the PARK LEK project, we can have an aesthetic moment. And I can have it with them too, not having been there, because I have other references that allow me to experience somebody else's experience. If we don't, we're doomed. And that's not the sole domain of art. But it is the goal of art, and it is the goal of social practice too. And for social practice, therein lies the power of change. Thank you. How do we do?
Thank you, Mary Jane.